I'm probably preaching to the choir, but a little punctuation can go a long way. The comma, for example, can change the entire meaning of a text with just a little movement. There are many examples that can be used to illustrate this point. One turns a political statement into a party, another a cannibalistic activity into a maternal luncheon, and, from the title of a book, some normal panda activity turns into a murderous dinner a guest. How are such dangerous errors made when punctuating? The confusion is the result of the historical development of recorded text. Punctuation and spacing has had both a syntactic function, to convey meaning and structure, and a prosodic function, to direct elocution. In order to demonstrate and test the importance of these two major functions, I had my two roommates read this text, from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. As you can see, I have taken out the spacing and punctuation, and I've also arranged the text into 2 columns with approximately 8 words per line. The results were both entertaining and enlightening. First is Colin.
It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However, little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood.
Colin is clearly struggling with separating the text into words without any context. Both roommates were given as little information as possible, and had to read without hearing the other, so it would be representative of their abilities. Once Colin discovers what the text pertains to, he is better able to read the text, even without syntactic instruction.
Is this Pride and Prejudice?
Yes.
One day, have you heard that that Netherfield Park I'll at last, Mr. Bennet replied that he had not, but it is returned she for Miss Long has just been here and she told me all about it. Mr. Bennet made no answer. Do not you want to know who has taken it? Cried his wife impatiently. You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it.
Next is Moeno. Moeno, as you will see, has a much easier time than Colin in separating the text into words. On the other hand, she lacks the elocution, intonation, and emotion that Colin was able to bring to the text without any prosodic direction from punctuation and spacing.
Universally acknowledged that a single man of possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However, little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood. This truth is so well fixed that in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or the other of their daughters. My dear Mr. Bennet, said his lady to him one day, have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last? Mr. Bennet replied that they had not, but it is returned. She for long has just been here, and she told me all about it. Mr. Bennet made no answer. Do not you want to know who has taken it? Cried his wife impatiently. You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it.
The most enlightening thing happened once my phone was away. Colin shared that he has a history of having trouble with text that is presented in long lines, like the one he was given, whereas Moeno said that the most important thing for her, if she had to choose between the syntactic function or the prosodic function, would be the prosodic function of punctuation, because she likes the thought that authors are able to express themselves as best as they can in the way that they want. So, while both had strengths in reading the text, they ultimately chose their weakness as the function that they value the most in punctuation. As previously mentioned, this tension between the syntactic and prosodic functions of punctuation and spacing has its roots in history. Though contentious, many attribute the prosodic function of punctuation before the 16th century. and a curious mix of prosody and syntax afterwards. With any history, the development of textual traditions was neither linear nor single-faceted. Naomi Barron, for example, attributes the early evolution of punctuation in England to 4 developmental standards: punctuation of Latin texts, punctuation of vernacular texts, the growth of silent reading, and the early days of printing. The early punctuation and spacing of Latin texts contributed to both prosody and syntax. Initially, Latin text had no spacing or visual aids. In part, this was because written text was primarily meant to serve as a record to the few who could read, and in part because component materials were expensive. Paul Singer points to 8th century Saxon and Celtic priests who had a weaker grasp on Latin as the main proponents for word spacing in texts. Because they struggled with the pronunciation of each word, they readily welcomed and duplicated text with word division, so they would be less liable to misspeak. This word division not only aided in oral reading, prosody, but also in silent recording, syntax. Monks and later scholars valued word separation because it made the job of copying text easier. Other textual features also merged to aid both prosody and syntax. Chapters, tables, indexes, and motifs would help guide the eyes through longer texts. By the 7th century, for example, a 2-column format became characteristic of the Christian Codex book. Along with these features, marginalia was commonly included by scribes to clarify text and meaning, and sometimes add personal reflections. Vernacular texts were also textually developed with punctuation and spacing for clarity. For example, vernacular lettre bâtarde texts of the mid-15th century eliminated virtually all abbreviations which might be difficult for laymen to understand. Moreover, aristocratic books of the 15th century used paragraph signs, underlining, and capitalization to divide texts into intellectual rather than theoretical units. Both religious persons and scholars participated in Barron's 3rd developmental standard, silent reading. As is evidenced by Moeno's and Collins' reading, it is difficult to read without any punctuation and spacing, and even more difficult to comprehend such a text silently. Sanger, for example, states that the stimulant for silent reading was not the observance of monastic silence, but the increasingly complex body of thought, known as scholasticism, that came to dominate education in the 12th and early 13th centuries. Reading aloud, even for the reader, made the comprehension of complex ideas slow and difficult. While there is not enough space and time to fully explain this phenomenon, silent reading changed how both groups interacted with texts. Structurally, it meant that repetition and other narrative modes of literacy were supplanted with more direct language and illustrations as accompaniment, as well as the other textual features mentioned before. Externally, it meant that the practice of reading changed. Individuals could read more and in greater depth. They could read controversial topics, they could read together in libraries, and they could read along in universities and churches. Early printing in the 15th and 16th centuries promised to provide some sort of standardization in punctuation and spacing. For the most part, early printing attempted to emulate the texts that they were copying. Later, however, changes were made to ease reproduction. Red underlining, denoting speech, was replaced with quotation marks. Marginalia was taken out, and printing houses developed their own standards. This standardization, conversely, did not apply across all printing houses and to all authorial styles. As Barron recounts, the printing industry also supported systematic, grammatically based punctuation. Aldus Manutius's set of 5 punctuation marks, comma, semicolon, colon, period, and question mark, introduced in the 1560s, was widely used by the end of the 16th century. Though Manutius intended his marks to indicate grammatical relationships within a sentence, printers often used Manutius's pointing system to indicate rhetorical pauses. This schizophrenic mix between professed function and actual usage has persisted to this day. It is not surprising, consequently, that Paul Brutho laments that there was little chance that ordinary writers, and especially young learners, would eventually come to trust in their own ability. Again, the tension between prosody and syntax within the history of punctuation is certain. Brousseau explains that some authors in the 17th century emphasized regulating composition according to logical standards. However, there are still many references to the prosodic nature of punctuation, referring to aspects of it in musical terms. Similarly, in the 18th century, sources give little specific advice on how to choose marks beyond relying on an intuitive sense of what constitutes degrees of sentential interdependence. Many original sources indicate that the prosodic and structural roles of punctuation should have roughly equal weight. Nowadays, contemporaries still argue over the nature of punctuation. David Olson, for instance, argues the evolution of writing systems is simply the history of the attempts to make a writing system which adequately and explicitly represents one's speech practices. Essentially, he argues for prosody. Scholes and Willis, on the other hand, argue that syntax and prosody are fundamentally incompatible. There are, for example, no spoken manifestations of capitalization, quotation marks, underlining, or word divisions. Words are sometimes spelled in ways they have never been pronounced, and rules governing syntactic punctuation are generally quite independent of speech. Orthography is not written speech, and never was. Barron does a nice job in explaining why this tension between prosody and syntax persists. It is because of the dual nature of oral and written English. One source of confusion is that however independent written English became, the role of writing as an aid to formal oratory was never suppressed. A second source of confusion is mismatches between professional standards, set by pedagogues or printers, and the punctuation habits of recognized writers, popular media, and learners themselves. With all of this confusion surrounding punctuation, both in history and practice, it should not be surprising that children, and even adults, are confused. Ferrero and Pontecorvo published a study of young learners, second graders, in order to investigate beginning punctuation. They found that punctuation doesn't come from a prosodic or a syntactic understanding, but rather from a graphic understanding. Hall also confirms that young children use punctuation graphically. For them it was as if punctuation had separate roots from writing, had no function in writing, and was a set of objects that were added to fulfill a teacher's request for marks to be distributed around, or at the end of a piece of writing. It was not a system which derived from any sense of making a contribution to how a writer might clarify the written manifestations of thought, or render them more accessible to the reader. It was not intrinsic to the act of writing, and for so many of the children, for so much of their time in the two classrooms, it was something that was added after the writing had been done. In the absence of any intrinsic relationship to the act of writing, graphic principles seemed to fulfill teacher expectations, were comprehensible to the children, and did not add significantly to the cognitive burden of becoming a writer. According to a study by Scholes and Willis, this confusion continues into adulthood, and transitions from punctuation as graphic to punctuation as either prosodic or syntactic. The university students they studied either read and wrote as a visual representation of speech, without reference to syntax, or read and wrote as orthography, without reference to prosody. In the end, we need to recognize that the current confusion surrounding the function of punctuation and spacing, whether prosodic or syntactic, is the result of centuries of debate. The best thing to do is to recognize that punctuation does in fact have both of these functions, and to teach children with this understanding. That way, we will be able to introduce younger students with the prosodic, intuitive nature of punctuation, and how it can clarify speech. Then, for older students, we can educate them in the syntactical nature of punctuation, and how the meaning of written language can change with just a little manipulation. By the end of this form of instruction, children and students will hopefully have a more sensitive understanding of the interplay between prosody and syntax, and be more ready, as Colin and Moeno were, to discuss where their own development can happen.